It's a very exciting time right now for our government customers. They're so excited about moving to Microsoft Cloud, the Azure Cloud. They're all almost at the version of yes, getting over the hump to yes, to saying, hey, I want to move major workloads, I want to start new projects in the cloud. How do we help them get there? Is there a process or a methodology we can bring to bear to get them over the hump, to get them to yes? Of course there is. Today we're going to be joined by Aaron Ward, a cloud strategist at Planet Technologies, who recently joined Planet after a long career at Microsoft. He's going to be leading you in a session called Mapping Out Your Journey to the Cloud. In this session, we're going to discuss proven techniques, proven methodologies to how Aaron and his organization are helping customers move virtual machines, move servers, move their DevOps, move applications and paths, and then also building them new, fresh from scratch, into the Azure Cloud. I'm really excited to have Aaron here today, and I think this is going to be a hugely beneficial presentation to those customers who are ready to get to yes. Aaron?
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that. When we think about how we got here from cloud, compute, just in general, a lot of times what we've dealt with is really a paralysis, a moment in time where we want to adopt cloud and it's not as easy as we thought. We have on-premises processes today that we work with, and we're trying to figure out how we adapt that to the cloud. When we think about some of the big problems that our customers are dealing with, a lot of it has to do with like cloud sprawl or the cost of that cloud sprawl. When we think about how we handle our virtualized on-premises environments today, there's many times departments or agencies that go ahead and implement a solution that we don't know whether or not we should decommission that in the future. We also have a lack of policies and procedures. How do we handle security? How do we handle role-based access? How do we handle networking? In the cloud, things are a lot different than they are with on-premises, and there's a lot of ramifications if we do things incorrectly. Also, the last aspect is our insights. How do we gain from a security and also a networking and also an admin access privilege to our environment within Azure itself? The Azure Virtual Data Center is very complex. Many times we have to think about all these different type of architectural considerations. Some of the benefits is that with Azure, everything's very flexible. But also with Azure, when we think about that, every decision point that we have to make, there's about 50 different options that we can use. When we think about these architectural considerations, some of them are is how do we handle our tenant and subscription architecture? How do we handle data governance, especially when we're dealing with either medical or state and local government? It could be CGIS, IRS 1075 PubSec, HIPAA compliancy, FISMA, FERPA, etc. How do we handle network security? Do we redesign our network security based on newer technologies and principles than we do today? Also, when we think about building management, one of the most important questions that need to be answered that causes the most hesitation and pause by customers is, how do I either do chargeback or how do I go ahead and manage these VMs and make sure that we are the most cost efficient? Well, when we think about this, there's a process to success. In order to get that process to be successful, really we gotta be thinking about 4 different areas. One, you have to assess your on-premises infrastructure. We have to look at the whole entire data center estate from clients to servers and be able to determine what workload and requirements are really there. The next aspect is designing, establishing that virtualized data center so it's enterprise ready. Very much like what we deal with our on-premises environments, but taking into account all those architectural considerations that I was talking about before. Next though is how do we build a migration factory? How do we ensure that we're going to have success by documenting, proving, and also assessing all the workloads that we may want to move into Azure itself? And then finally is actually doing a proof of concept, a pilot, that enables us to go ahead and prove all of the decision points that we've done in the previous sessions for design and for our build. Realistically, when we journey to Azure, the success and expectations that are needed is surrounding around assessing our on-premises environment, designing that virtual data center, and finally planning that proof of concept workload. But the thing is that most customers realize is that documentation is absolutely key and critical. Within Azure, there are so many different options. Within cloud compute in general, there are so many different options that we need to document. We need to have a summary of assessment of our on-premises environment. We have to be able to implement a baseline virtual data center that is documented with all of our decision points. And then we also have to have a workload migration plan and execution. And this is significant because without this, we cannot ensure success. At Planet, we created what we call as our Enterprise Cloud Readiness for Azure to assist customers in this difficult process. This process is a proven methodology that provides foundational architecture and configuration recommendations to establish that enterprise virtual data center. Planet has created this entire assessment from beginning to end to ensure that our customers have success. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it back over to Steve Winter for our panel discussion.
Great, Aaron, and thank you very much for taking us through that. We've got an incredible panel of industry experts with us today to discuss, hey, making this journey to the cloud. With us today is Ali Khan. Ali is a public sector solution specialist with a focus on healthcare. Correct. George Scott, a cloud strategist with Planet Technologies. Mark Quickel, who's the practice manager overseeing dev and data as well as SharePoint technologies at Planet Technologies. And Bob Ballard, who's our principal cloud strategist with Planet. Aaron, let me start with you. In my intro remarks, I mentioned these customers that are almost at yes. What are the most common questions or roadblocks you see these customers having that this proven methodology answers?
Well, a lot of times, customers that are trying that have said yes but are just stalled is a lot of times is trying to figure out how to design that virtual data center correctly for security purposes. Also, when they're moving forward, not just for infrastructure as a service, but how are they going to move their development environment? A lot of times when we're dealing with chief financial officers, their biggest question is about cloud sprawl and budget. You know, how do we determine that? And the benefit of Planet's Enterprise Cloud Readiness is that we answer all those questions.
Great. Let's harp in and focus in on that security. Ali, especially with your focus on healthcare, security, governance, these are pretty important things that are addressed in this proven methodology. What are you seeing with your customers at Microsoft, your healthcare government customers?
Well, Steve, they typically ask for all the FedRAMP certifications around how the cloud meets the FedRAMP requirements that they have. We work very closely with the information security officers to make sure that we are mapping their enterprise controls to the cloud security controls. That's a little bit of a new paradigm for that type of an office. But we are basically working with the information security team very closely as part of the journey to the cloud.
And are we seeing anything, you know, Bob, are we seeing anything in our customer segments around governance? Because I know we throw that out a lot. It's a terminology that gets thrown out a lot, but it appears to me that it's a major roadblock.
Yeah, well, you know, the issue really is, you know, they have these sort of compliance needs, right? They're trying to map to the FedRAMP accreditations and HIPAA and all of those things. And how you sort of translate that to sort of a different access control methodology, right? How we are, and suddenly we have servers that might be able to be accessed in different ways than typically we've had before, et cetera. So what's really important here is to sort of map that back. What I try to do when I work with customers is sort of build a grid of here are all the decisions you need to make to sort of meet this compliance standard, and who made them, why they made them, and capture all of that, right? Because now the biggest thing we also see is we can think we're right today, then either new technology or new perspective comes into play, and we need to go back and revisit that, right? So this is sort of a circular motion over time with customers as well.
And I think that we're seeing this, and Ali, I want to shoot back to you on this topic too, because I'm sure you're seeing it. You know, there's this notion sometimes that, you know, governance is governance, security is security, but of course, each one of these sectors and each customer has somewhat of a different concern, right?
Absolutely, yes. So as far as the governance is concerned, they do go hand in hand with security, but it's an ongoing process for both those areas. Yeah. And they just need to be, it's an iterative process as well. And we just need to keep addressing it with the customers.
And that's where this concept of a methodology, a proven way to take customers from beginning to end. And I mean, Aaron, that's being addressed, right?
That is.
Yeah. In what ways? How is that being addressed?
Well, a lot of times when we're assessing their entire environment, we're helping them determine what workloads are not only from a complex or cloud fit, but also from a compliance or certification requirement. So when we're working with state and local government customers, as an example, we have a lot of times we're dealing with CGIS certification requirements. We're also dealing with a lot of increased security, both on an IRS 1075 PubSec perspective. So the goal is not just to say, hey, here's a workload that can lift and shift into Azure. It's not that at all. It's here is a workload that compliance can be made easier to attain certification through Azure. And here is the methodology on how we would move this workload from an on-premises environment into Azure accordingly. And that's how our methodology seems to work very well for all of our customers.
Yeah, it's a super interesting challenge. You know, George, one of the things that we're seeing and I'm seeing when I talk to customers is, you know, this notion that it's just another data center for them, right? They want to view this cloud data center as something completely odd, but really they're just kind of taking the same principles, the same controls, the same security view that they should have on their on-premises data center and moving it to the cloud, right? I mean,
Absolutely. One of the advantages is there's much more advanced security available in Azure that you can enable much easier than you can do on a local data center. So the reality is if you do it right from the beginning, which is what the ECR is all about, you end up with a more secure environment than you have on premise.
and so that gets wrapped into the virtual data center design then, I assume, right?
That is. And then also it enables us to create net new applications that are designed with that security foundation focus.
You read my mind because I was just about to go to the application piece. So Mark, let's bring that into to your area. That's your area of specialty. So, you know, sometimes, you know, customers get very, very focused on this whole lift and shift concept. I'm going to move VMs, I'm going to move servers there. But, you know, of course, our customers, our government customers have an unbelievable amount of applications, you know, in there and databases and other things like that in their environment. Talk a little bit about, you know, within this methodology, how you're helping customers move those applications, moving the data to the cloud.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think as it came up in a presentation a little while ago, you know, there's a few different angles we look at. We certainly look at the economics of it from one perspective. You know, there might be certain things that customers are hearing about from a platform as a service, you know, containerization and those types of technologies, which are really great and really fantastic, but we have to think about whether or not it really works well for their organization. So that's one thing. And then we're taking a look at, you know, different applications maybe that they're developing internally, as well as applications that are third party. Things like Esri, for example, you know, are just key applications that the organization's using. And we want to make sure that we're putting together that really good assessment. So planning is very, very key in documenting that success. And we're spending time with developers typically during that process as well. We're spending time with managers of development to think through that process, and we're trying to look at it holistically from a DevOps perspective and a development perspective, but then we're also trying to be very tactical in moving a few workloads that will basically show the sort of the proof of concept of how to get there.
So talk to us a little bit about, you know, some of the different decision points that are going on between, you know, an application and moving an application in current state to the cloud, maybe looking at an app modernization through PaaS in the cloud, then of course the whole born in the cloud pieces. Like, talk to me a little bit about the different decision points there.
Sure. For like existing applications, you know, we're looking at things like what dependencies exist. Who are your application stakeholders? Because ultimately those are the people that are going to have to own that, you know, application moved to the cloud. And maybe it's a one-for-one, or maybe there's certain things that they have to consider. We look at things like licensing, and does if you're using like a third-party product, does it support cloud? You know, that's really important. For net new applications, or maybe existing, say, .NET applications that are moving to the cloud, you know, we want to look a little bit at the process, because our belief is that if you don't have a really solid process for sort of modernizing and delivering the applications to the cloud, things like source control and centralized artifact repositories, then you're ultimately not going to be able to take the best advantage of the cloud. So we do take a look at some of that aspect of it, but then we a lot of times just take a simple workload. Hey, you're using Azure Active Directory authentication. You're using Active Directory authentication on premise. Let's just convert to Azure Active Directory and show you how easy that is and take advantage of MFA and single sign-on and all those things.
So when you're going through the assessment portion of, in your case, it's ECR, but of course it's a process here, right? When you're going through that assessment process, are you showing customers like low, medium, and high impacts in addressing some of the things that Mark's talking about, both from an app perspective as well as a VM, lift and shift?
That's a great question. So our data center assessment tools enable us to, as an organization, to have a view of the whole entire estate. With that assessment tool, we are not only able to see a cloud fit, which is a high, medium, low, but we're also able to establish what those interdependencies are to assist in whether it be a lift and shift. So a great example might be is we have a certain application that is running that is tied to maybe a database server, whether it's Oracle, SQL, MySQL, but we determined that if we're going to move that application, we have to move that database. Well, if we move that database, there's interdependencies of that database to maybe other workloads because we're doing maybe an enterprise database architecture. So when we start thinking about that, the customer gets a complete visibility of their environment from just that one little aspect of the ECR, which is our cloud assessment. But the benefit of the cloud assessment, that moves us into workshops, right? And those workshops enable us to, based on how their environment is designed and what we acquire for knowledge together from the organization and Planet and Microsoft, it enables us to tailor those workshops to enable a true enterprise virtual data center that fits their organization's needs. And I do strongly believe that every organization is similar, but they all are unique. And with the ECR, Enterprise Cloud Readiness workshops, that enables us to make those unique decisions to implement a true, secure, and migration workload readiness type of environment to be able to leverage for their organization.
So within the process that you described, Aaron, we've sort of discussed and dove into the assessment piece. We've talked about some of the workshops around governance. We've talked a little bit about the virtual data center. But Ali, I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the things you're seeing customers struggle with within the virtual data center? And then I'd love to sort of address how it's being addressed within process and procedure.
I think the biggest thing that I wouldn't say struggle, it's actually just the choices that you have. I think Aaron in his introduction said it very well. When you go with Azure, there are many ways to solve a problem. There are many platform services, infrastructure services, so it really comes down to what the customer's priority is in terms of moving the workload and then picking the right solution. But on the flip side, I would also say that if the customer's solution is a modular solution, then the workshops that Aaron mentioned is actually a very good way of stepping into the cloud, because you can start small in a workshop, see how it works, and then start bringing the other modules or other pieces of the application in as well.
So that brings out one of the things I think that is so important as you kind of pick your process here. Okay, hey, I've done an assessment, I know my low, medium, high impacts, right. I've taken a look at my applications, I've designed my virtual data center, but I think it's really important at the end of this to put something into production. Don't just analysis paralysis here, right? Like, let's get something in production. So Bob, what kind of proof of concept workshops? Let's not even call them proof of concepts, let's call them production pilot workloads. Right. Are you seeing customers want to jump into?
Well, so that's a great question. There's a number of ways you can go, right? And what I always like to talk to customers about this is you need sort of a balance between quick wins that can drive something very quickly and high value, right? So, and you can't overload on either one. So if you do a bunch of quick wins, that's great. Hey, we got something that works. We're all high-fiving, but we look around and we're like, okay, what we have there are a bunch of minor impact things that we put up there. So it starts to be the place where we put stuff that's not important to the enterprise, right? On the flip side of that, if we pick the biggest, baddest application in the enterprise and start there, and we get nowhere for 4 months because it's so complicated, Then what we have is this stuff is way too hard. I don't understand. It was supposed to be easy. So usually what I talk about customers is, hey, let's target some quick low-hanging fruit, something in the and then get something that's of high value. But we sort of, as through the workshops and discussions, right, say it's high value. It's a little more difficult than moving a couple of websites up there or some basic standalone IaaS applications. But it's more, provides more value, to the enterprise. It's one of the key enterprise applications, but just not the most complicated one we could come up with. As far as what types of things they are, when we're thinking about quick wins, that's things like ADFS in Azure, and maybe your domain controllers, maybe some quick websites, etc. When we start looking at high value things, maybe it's an enterprise application in which potentially maybe we're moving the database to PaaS, right? There's a tremendous financial impact and flexibility and scalability impact that could be very positive from that change. It does require a little bit of effort and thought, but the payoff is high, and it's not so huge a lift, right, that we can't do it, right? And that's sort of the balance that I often talk to customers about.
And so within your assessment process, you have a kind of a standard list, right, of production pilots. What are in your sort of standard list?
Well, the benefit of the standard list is that, like I mentioned before, each customer is unique. So they could be a lift and shift customer. We just want to move VM to infrastructure as a service. But we have other customers that are, we want to get out of the VM business and we want to go into the cloud. So some of the workload examples would be for infrastructure as a service. Some organizations want disaster recovery and backup. How do we do that? Can you do that with us in a kick the tires sort of fashion? Others are, we are ready to lift and shift. Let's start lifting and shifting possibly 10 workloads. Some customers, we want to actually do application transformation, not modernization, right? Modernization requires true application assessment, how we might have to rewrite code. Transformation would be more of, hey, we're running at an IIS or Apache today. Let's move that into a web app. How can we do that? Last example, though, which is I think one of our most dynamic and high value return on investment, as like Bob mentioned, is being able to do a data transformation. And that could be something from like shadow IT, such as dealing with access databases that are not secure, that are doing a whole bunch of different stuff that we might be able to leverage, like Azure Tables or Azure Sequel, or it could be even, we have a high-priced database architecture that we developed applications on, but we're not utilizing it outside of a database, and we don't want to pay maybe a database tax in the cloud. Let's move to Azure Sequel from a PaaS perspective. So we have a lot of great options that are allows our customers to kick the tires to put real workloads in Azure and gain benefit.
So George, as we look at this whole process here, again, like we talked about, assessment up front, then we're doing virtual data center design, we're talking about governance workshops, chargeback, billback workshops, but ultimately, having that production workload. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of making sure that we go into this with the concept of putting something in production.
Correct, great question. I think the idea, and Bob touched on this, you got your quick wins and then you got your harder wins. But there's also applications and solutions that just run better in the cloud. So if you can get stuff like AD and ADFS in the cloud so that you can do cloud-based authentication, your websites, external websites that are coming in from the cloud anyway, those it just makes sense to move. So those would be top on my list. And then, having a financial application or maybe, just something that needs some expansion or elasticity to be able to expand the database at certain times of the month, maybe around payroll or something like that. That's an application that just fits in the cloud perfectly. So ending up with something in there that, like, as Bob said, it's not like a toy up there. You're actually, now Azure is part of your environment, and that it's going to be, and you've got motivation to keep going. And you did it right to begin with, so you can keep going, and it's easier to get applications.
Yeah, I've heard Bob call it before. He says, hey, we want to have that migration factory, right? We want to have that factory of ready to do that. Ali, what about those customers that have maybe launched something in Azure, maybe they've had a VPN set up or something, but they haven't gone through a process like this. So they just decided to quickly put a pilot or something in Azure. Right now they have something up there. They think they have a data center. Maybe they're in Classic, maybe they're not in ARM. But what kind of advice are you giving those customers to kind of get into a methodology like this?
Well, I think the methodologies help a lot because we always see intersections. If somebody has done it before, there's going to be some type of intersection. So we actually encourage that. So methodologies like yourself, where you actually do an assessment, there's a framework involved. I think that helps customers a lot because they will see that about 70 to 80%, it's going to coincide with somebody else who did the same exact thing, right? So we are encouraging our customers to adopt a framework, adopt a methodology that really helps them.
And that's really important because we do have a lot of customers that have lit something up, right? They've put something up there, but, you know, and I think one of the great things about a process is, you know, again, like you can plug and play some of these pieces. So, you know, maybe that VDC design is front-ended with a health check or something like that. Let's make sure you're modern. Because I think that's one of the other things that our customers constantly are forgetting in the cloud is, you know, Microsoft's rolling out, I mean, every month there's a whole new services and a whole new way and kind of staying up to date a little bit. So, you know, Bob, any concept of how customers can stay up to date? Like,
yeah, well, so just real quick to the point you were making before, I think the biggest mistake that customers make, whether it's Azure that we're talking about now or Office 365 or any of the cloud services, is they try to duplicate what they've been doing on a technology that does so much more than what you can do, right? You know, so you know, first of all, just kind of getting this mindset, you know, getting this mindset that you can, you know, that you have a wealth of new possibilities. But as, you know, as far as staying up to date, there's a lot of ways. I mean, obviously, you know, there are, you know, Microsoft communicates pretty well on this. Although the problem is, of course, that communications are coming from lots of different directions and trying to understand where to go and who the, you know, where should I be following and which things are important to me, et cetera. You know, one of the things we're doing for a lot of our customers at Planet is we have a community call for our, you know, what we call our, you know, our best customers, the You Already Own It community call once a month, and they range in topics. Sometimes they're always Microsoft Cloud oriented, but you know, they can be Dynamics, they can be Office 365, they can be Azure. But the panel of, you know, George and Aaron and myself, and we're leading these conversations to try to bring what we think are the most important topics interactively with our customers on a monthly basis. And then as a follow-up, sending out our curated list of the best articles, blog posts, et cetera, that come out every month to those same customers.
Just to add to that, that's part of the ECR is the knowledge transfer. Now, as we're doing the ECR, we're doing knowledge transfer with the customer. So it's not like they come out with just a data center and some workloads. They also come out with the knowledge to run their Azure environment.
well, I think this was a great discussion, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time. As you can see, you need to define a process. These gentlemen have talked to you about one that works. There are others. But you want to make sure that there's a framework that you can move into that you know that's going to step by step get your virtual data center design, make sure you answer those governance questions, make sure you assess your environment and figure out what's a good fit. And also when you're defining what's a good fit, you're also defining what's a bad fit. But go through this process, and at the end, make sure you have a production workload. Make sure you're using this technology so you can make it part of your decision process moving forward. What works in cloud, what should be born in cloud, what should be moved with cloud, and what should stay on premise. Thanks very much. All right, what a powerful session. Thank you everybody for joining. See, we've got a fantastic group of attendees here. Hopefully you found that to be an exciting and interesting session. You have a Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to throw us your questions. What we're going to do now is we have the panelists from the session on with us right now. And so we're going to go through and answer any of your live questions. So with me, I've got Jeff Fowler, who's new to the panel, but Jeff, welcome. Jeff's one of our security strategists here at Planet Technologies. Bob Ballard is with us. George Scott is with us. Aaron Ward is with us, and Mark Quickel. So guys, thanks for taking your time again. I think the first question we have is, I think it was a great one. Let me read it out to everybody and see who wants to kind of jump in. The largest hurdle has been getting the business process to change from an annual or every 3-year purchase for hardware to a pay for what you need approach. What input do you have to help me through that new purchasing way roadblock? So I don't know, Aaron, you want to jump in initially on that one?
Yeah, sure. So great question, by the way. Also, I see that, a fear of cost sprawl within the organization. So a couple things that we really focus on within the cloud assessment, our data center assessment tools really provides a great budgetary number for your organization on basically how much it will cost to run these workloads within Azure itself. When we get into the engagement of the ECR itself, it really provides us certain workloads that we want to get down to the actual penny. Now, a lot of times when we're thinking about for our organizations that are really on this monolithic 3-year, 5-year refresh cycles, we really need to move from that capital expenses over to an operation expenses. And that methodology or thought really needs to be around, very much how you guys pay for electricity, how much you're paying for just, utilities. In essence, really, cloud compute becomes one of those aspects. Now, the other thing that to take into account for cost sprawl is, what do we place within boundaries within cloud to ensure that we're not just going ahead and implementing a service that can't be decommissioned. So great example is a lot of times I'm working with customers and especially central IT, you'll ask them, what are the agencies or departments within your organization actually running? Do they need these VMs still anymore? And a lot of times the issue is that the process hasn't been in place for decommissioning workloads that just aren't being used anymore. So a lot of times we provide guidance around that to be able to enable organizations to not only control their cost sprawl, but then also budget for it accordingly on an annual basis, as well as helping them, with different type of provisioning and deprovisioning processes to help their organization.
That's great. Does any of the other panelists want to jump in on that question around cost sprawl, as well as the notion of kind of changing from to use as you pay as you use it strategy?
Yeah, so I'll take just a couple. I think Aaron did a good job, but just a couple more things. So one of the things that an assessment does for you is help you understand, is this particular workload a good fit? And there's lots of reasons why it might not be, right? One of them might be that, it's technology that doesn't transition well to the cloud, and that's becoming a more and more limited case, but they do exist. But another big one is, this particular workload has high cost, low value things going on in it. For example, do we really want to move, certain things like file shares, for instance, to the cloud, when there are other opportunities in cloud services, for instance, to get them into OneDrive, some of those other things. So just sort of looking at your workloads as well and saying, is this in fact a good fit from a cost perspective, let alone technology, helps also limit those so that you're not putting these really expensive, lower value applications up there, is another way that we sort of address this as well.
I think something else too, Bob and Aaron, within the assessment and within your, migration planning, there is the opportunity to understand that there's a concept of a phased buy-in, right? So you're going to be paying for this on a monthly basis, but as you start looking at maybe seasonal type servers that you might be putting up there that might be highly active during certain times, there's some predictive analysis that you can do there. Of course, you're not going to be migrating everything at one time. You can make some predictions in terms of what kind of servers are going to be born in the cloud and kind of when. So there is some forecasting that you can do and manage to as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron, did you want to go ahead?
No, I was completely in agreement. I mean, that's really the big benefit is being able to place those boundaries around those computes, and then unlike what we do with on-premises where we leave things running 24/7, 365, we have the ability to workloads that we aren't utilizing from, let's say, 4 p.m. to 6 a.m. We shut them down. That way we're not paying for that stuff anymore. So it's really surrounding about how we handle automation, and then handling the compute that's truly needed when it's needed. And like you're referring to, Steve, is the ability to also have auto scaling. So whether it's with infrastructure as a service, so as an example might be that I have an application that realistically, out of the 12 months, maybe 1 or 2 months of it requires a large amount of compute, right? Today with on-premises, we plan for that 80% compute capability, but run at 1 to 2% during the whole year. So within Azure, I have the ability to go ahead and say, you know what, I'm gonna increase that compute when we need it, because we know when it's gonna happen. And then for the rest of the time, we just go ahead and we bring it down to what we truly need for our day-to-day operations.
Yeah, so I think to answer the question as directly as possible, there's a budgeting forecasting piece that goes into both your migration planning as well as your seasonality of your machines, the overall usage of your machines, and of course your sort of born in the cloud machines. And this methodology, which is driving the session, is of course equipped to handle that and help that budget forecasting. I want to move on to the next question. There's been discussion on Azure being secured. How secure is it? Also, how is it compared to other cloud computing solutions, for example, OpenStack? And Jeff, I'll go ahead and throw that to you since you have security in your title.
Sure. Happy to address that question. So like all things, it is as secure or insecure as you make it, because really when you look at security in general in the cloud, there's really a shared trust model where Microsoft is securing the infrastructure, the data center, making sure the people who access your systems go through security background checks. In the US government facilities, make sure they are US citizens, for example. And they basically secure everything from the platform on up to where you come in and step in to take care of securing your environment. You can look at things such as managing and controlling your identity and access for your users, for example, for Azure AD, which you can tie back to your on-premises ID to make sure that you have everything secured and linked up and working according to how you want it to be from a security perspective. You can also encrypt all of your communications and operational processes between your on-prem site as well as your users working from remote, connecting to Azure and your workloads there. You can also focus on how you handle your network, and infrastructure security across the board. So there's really a lot of things you can do to help ensure that your environment is fully secured. You can also talk about defending against threats. Basically, Microsoft takes an assumed breach perspective when it comes to security. They fully anticipate that everything has been hacked, will be hacked, and it's only a matter of time until you're hacked again. So in that regard, they want to make sure that when they started with the security development lifecycle, when they developed Azure, they started the foundation of understanding and security and training all of their staff involved in creating Azure to make sure it was just secure by default from the beginning. Also, you can use the Azure Security Center as your one-stop shop location for all things security in the cloud. We can look at different dashboards and information and run audits and look at the logs of all of your systems to make sure it is as secure as you need to be. But really, you can also look at the Trust Center, which is a great place to learn about security and how Azure is designed to be secure, how you can help ensure that your environment is secure. Another way of going about it is also Secure Score, which is basically a gamification of security where you can look at a great dashboard, tells you how well you're doing in security of your workstations, your Azure environment, and your Office 365 environment across the board. So there's really a lot of options there in terms of how you can ensure that your Azure is secure and make sure that you're keeping the bad guys out and the good people in and do what you need to do from a mission perspective, make sure it's productive as possible. There's also a few other things I know. Bob, you wanted to chime in with regards to the different Azure environments and compliance.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. So a couple of things. One, security and compliance is a key tenet of Microsoft around Azure, and it has been from the very beginning. If you look at sort of the RSS feeds and the blog posts about new features and functions and capabilities being added, 30 to 40% of them on a regular basis are security or compliance related. That kind of mirrors along with the fact that there's 3 flavors of Azure available to government customers, depending on, what your needs are and what your particular organization may qualify for. So, as an example, there's a standard commercial flavor of Azure that's available that many of our customers, including government ones, run a lot of their data center services. There's the standard government community cloud, which offers, additional controls around FBI background checks to meet compliance standards such as CJIS, which is criminal justice information security, or IRS 1075, which is, I was once on the field advisory board for Office 365 compliance while I was still at Microsoft, and probably one of the more stringent standards you'll ever see in any government setting. All the way up to new L4/5 tenants, so the code named sort of GCC High, or nicknamed GCC High, which provides significantly more increased security around, and a lot of this stuff, interestingly enough, just to be clear, I would not say that the actual physical environments around technology per se are more secure, although there are a few things that are turned off to prevent you from sort of making yourself unsecure. The primary thing there, though, is things like process and documentation and auditing additional controls, et cetera, that are required by these more stringent standards like NIST 800-171 or CJIS and IRS 1075 in the standard GCC scenario. So hopefully that was helpful.
Terrific. Thanks, guys. Moving on to some of the next questions. Is there a way to experiment with the Azure environment before incurring any costs or committing to costs? Not sure who wants to jump in on that.
So the short answer, I guess I'll take it.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
So the short answer is yes, there absolutely is. There's a couple of ways, and as a follow-up, I think obviously I'm actively talking, so I can't go look up and get you the links, but I will post them back in the Q&A section. So number one, if your organization has any Msdn subscriptions, it automatically qualifies you. There are also trial subscriptions available with limited amount of infrastructure you can put in place. But certainly allows you to play around and get things going. As a matter of fact, in many of our customer pilots and production pilots, we start with a trial subscription and then update it as they go ahead and take care of their licensing. The other thing is, with very limited spend on your part, we have customers that sort of get approval from their management, et cetera, to say, hey, can I put $100 a month on my, my expense account kind of card or whatever that might be, or can I get reimbursed for that to start developing an Azure lab, $100, $200, something like that. And you can actually get quite a bit of services, particularly if you're diligent about spinning them down. So, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can go about looking at that, particularly if you, the MSDN one or maybe, low investment $100 kind of thing, give you ongoing access to the environment.
And Bob and George, the trial, isn't that called Azure Pass? Is that what it is? It's an Azure Pass. Is that what it's called? I believe that's what it's called. I think it's called Azure Pass.
I think George, I can't hear George's mic, so.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Okay, next question, and hopefully Mark Quickle, you can address this one. As it relates to transforming internally developed apps to the cloud, what does that process look like? Does the ECR cover a complete rewrite of the application?
Sure, thanks, Steve. And just to go back actually on the last question too, I want to comment on the cost on the PaaS services. Is actually a lot of services that are free to start. So it's a great way to get started with some of the web apps, SQL, Azure Search, a couple of those types of services for free. But to the question at hand, what we try to do during the ECR is actually look at your application that you're trying to move and figure out the best way to get there. As Bob mentioned earlier, I think it was, we're trying to see what makes sense to move to the cloud. In some cases, if that is a simple web application, yeah, we can probably go ahead and just migrate that application and leave it as is. If we're talking more about the actual transformation of applications, that is, how do we take advantage, maybe it's due to cost, or maybe it's due to security, or some of these other things that we're talking about, to maximize the benefit of Azure's cloud for your application. We, during the ECR process, we'll actually typically take a single workload and try to migrate that with you. So we'll review your app, We'll look at what it's supposed to do, what its on-premise capabilities are, who the stakeholders are, and then we will try to take, say, Active Directory and migrate to Azure Active Directory. Or if there's a lot of data that could potentially go to NoSQL type solutions, we'll look at the best way to migrate that, and which would, hopefully bring down your cost and improve the performance of the system. So that's what we typically would look at, a single workload for the actual work, but we'll try to give you guidance around the entire application.
Great, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Again, I want to encourage everybody. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions, because we're getting close here to the end of the session. If you have anything you would like to see answered, please make sure you drop it in that Q&A. One of the questions that I would like to double down on, we talked a little bit of it during the actual presentation and panel discussion, but I would really like to double down on, what are the areas where you see organizations, what are the areas of cloud that causes organizations to halt adoption?
So, Steve, this is a great question. So a lot of times, the reason why organizations halt is Azure is very complex in the sense of how I can go about solving, a particular issue that I'm looking at trying to solve. So it gets down to even like taxonomy governance. There's 50 different ways to do each aspect that we need to figure out. And the problem becomes it just becomes a daunting task, especially for organizations that wear multiple hats. So you'll have, a smaller IT or IT that is just currently really overwhelmed as it is. And for them to tackle such a large animal as, being able to set up their virtualized data center tends to either one of three things. Either it forces them into Azure or cloud compute just in general quicker than they should go because of things weren't decided on. And what happens is they'll get down to a certain path and may have to either start over or do a migration from one subscription over to another so it fulfills some of the taxonomy and governance that they're thinking about. Another one, though, is a lot of times is not having the knowledge up front to be able to ensure that they're implementing secured VMs or workloads within their cloud compute can sometimes get them into a situation where they don't believe they're as secure as they need to be. So that tends to be another issue where folks really start hesitating about whether or not they're going to move forward, which again, with our readiness program, we really help customers not only learn about how to take care of the stuff, but then also real world application of implementing the enterprise cloud. And the final one, like we mentioned before, is around the financial. There is a lot of FUD out there, fear, uncertainty, and doubt surrounding about costs. And a lot of times when I'm working with our customers, we just got done with an engagement last week with a great customer. Their initial expectations is that their workload that they were choosing to look at within Azure itself was going to be astronomically costly, just because of perceptions of cloud sprawl and in their mindset that there's no way that this could be cheaper, and to their delight, they found it to be almost about 60 to 70% cheaper than what they could do on premises, especially since they were right near the end of having to do a hardware refresh cycle. So for the most part, those are the big three areas is, how do I handle, not knowing enough about cloud just because we're just inundated with work as it is. Number two is security, and then number three is the cost sprawl.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Sorry, I'm trying to drive this question. So along the lines of the cost sprawl, we have another question here about, the fear around DR costs, and, the DR costs can be extremely high. And I know we do have a session later on in the summit specifically on DR, but I don't know, does anybody want to jump in and kind of address the perception around DR costs being extremely high?
Sure, I answered it in the QA. You can hear me, right, Steve?
Sure.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I answered it in the QA, but ingress is free, egress cost, but it's very, very minimal. I've used the Azure calculator to do several examples of doing a full disaster recovery and having to bring back over terabytes of data, and it's very minimal on there. So in my opinion, the best way to check that out or to find out for yourself is just to take up your normal, what you're using for backup, and go to the Azure cost calculator, put it in there. You can get the cost of what it would cost to keep that backup and do backups into the cloud. But more importantly, to answer your question, how much it would cost to do a full recovery from the cloud on premise. And it's very minimal.
Yeah, and I believe, George, that session, I think, is actually starts at 1 o'clock today, your session on DR, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Pacific.
Yes, it does. There was
Sure.
another question about state contracts, Steve. I
Yeah,
know we're on most of
I answered it privately, but
Okay.
yeah, so definitely, certainly love to talk to you about that as well. There's also a question here about whether or not you can use some planning services vouchers towards the ECR. Yeah, absolutely you can, because it's planning. So without question, you certainly can do that. One more question here. I plan to do a hybrid for DR, but how does cost for SQL Server data egress compare?
So the data goes back and forth, and as whatever goes into Azure is free. When it comes out of Azure, that's where the cost is. Again, it's minimal. I don't have the numbers, but if anybody wants to reach out to me, it's gscott@goplanet.com. I'm happy to work with you on a cost for that.
Go-Planet. Don't forget the hyphen.
Thanks.
Okay, do we have any further questions? Fantastic. Well, a very lively Q&A. We're happy to have answered the questions for everybody. We're going to have about 5 minutes here before the next session. You see everybody's contact information there on the screen. Certainly feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have. The next session will start at noon Eastern Time, 9 Pacific, right on the dot. That section is entitled Migration Complete. Now what? This is all about next steps associated with the adoption of the M365 cloud. Thanks for everybody. We'll see you in about 5 or 6 minutes.